Are you under any sort of like quarantine?
Yeah, I haven't left the house in weeks now. I took out the recycling on Thursday, which was exciting, and I might take out the trash today. But no, I haven't been out at all. But I'm also lucky that I can. A lot of things have been cancelled, but the basic work I can do when I'm at home. So I have been sitting and working, and the fridge is full, and I can just get on with things. So it's a very unusual way of living for me. But it's but like you, I'm very fortunate to be able to just get on with things.
Yeah, it's been interesting for me to like. It's been nice to have something to do, you know, like keep going, because I don't know, I did have all these like plans for like if we weren't going to be here, I was going to catch up on all this reading and do all these projects, and it hasn't happened that way, unfortunately, but that's fine. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, having a job and a bit of money is worth having.
Yes, because my partner, she's a hairstylist, so she can't work at all. Like, she's not allowed to. And so one of us having income has made it a lot easier and less stressful than it very much could have been. Because I know a lot of people that are out of work, and yeah, I can't imagine trying to get by that way. And our government, I don't know exactly what's happening over there, but we're very slow at helping anyone do anything.
Yeah, I've been reading about that. Our government has been inadequate, but there hasn't been nothing.
Right.
The issue is partly they kind of rolled out the various sort of protections gradually. So there was a time when one sector of society was being protected. There was nothing for the self-employed people, and then there's money for the self-employed people, but there wasn't anything for whatever. So it's been a slightly piecemeal thing, I think, probably inevitably. But slowly that we're reaching the point where we kind of know where the safety net is going to be for people. It hasn't solved every problem yet, but we're moving very slowly in the right direction.
Yes, it's very much the same here. Yeah, it's been like there is some sort of support coming, but none of it's actually been doled out to anyone.
Yeah.
And so nobody knows when we're getting anything. And so again, I feel fortunate that we had a little bit of money saved up, and I can work. And once we do get something, that'll be good. But I don't know how other people are making it. It's kind of frightening, but
there's a lot of that around.
Yeah. But I guess that's not all we're here to talk about. We can get all the depressing stuff out.
There are still other things.
Yes. I wanted to thank you for doing this on short notice tonight. And
not at all. I'm very happy to talk.
But I appreciate it. And I don't know who is going to be watching this or who will be familiar with you, but you are an author and a translator. And I know you primarily for your translations. And I'm always...
That's probably.
Pardon?
That's for the best, I think.
Okay. How did you...
There are many of my translations which I recommend. There are fewer of the other things that I recommend.
But you're pretty prolific, I would say, as far as translators go. Or where would you put yourself as far as your output?
I am pretty prolific. I mean, I've probably published, I think, 5 books. I mean, they come in kind of clumps as well. I probably published 5 books, at least in the US market, in the last 6 or 7 months, which is not typical, but I'm prolific partly because I work fast. I mean, I do just work quite quickly. I produce quite quickly, but also, even though I do lots of other things, translation is the thing that I do to earn a living. And so it's not something that I do occasionally between other things as a sort of passion project. I'm very fortunate that there is enough work for me to be able to be translating all the time if I want to. and because it's the thing I do to make a living, the aim is to do, 4 or 5 books a year steadily. Some variation of the kind of thing, but so yeah, there's always. I'm also lucky at the moment. I think much luckier than many people that I'm offered enough work that I plan quite a long time in advance. So I have about the next 6 books to translate. I think it's 6 are kind of stacked up over the next year. So I know that I can just kind of keep, the conveyor going.
And when you say that you have the work planned out, like is it generally like you're picking out what you're wanting to translate, or is it people are coming to you?
People come to me. Publishers offer me things, and I say yes. Usually, I do sometimes say no, but mostly it's people offering me things and me deciding whether or not I want to accept them. It very occasionally happens that I will bring something to a publisher, pitch something to a publisher, but for the most part, and again, this is very, very fortunate, I realize, for the most part, it's people either approaching me out of the blue with a sort of proposition of some kind, or it's people I'm sort of in quite a regular contact with, publishers I'm in touch with all the time, and we're talking about what they might be doing, and I might read something for them that they're thinking about publishing or not. I also, having now published lots of books, I'm also now in a position where 3 of the next 6 books I'm doing are the next book by a writer I've worked on before. So there are also those kind of recurring ones. I have a new Julian Fuks, and I have a new Agualusa, and I have a new Paulo Scott, who are all people I've done once or many times before. So that's the other thing, that as long as those writers continue to have careers in English, which isn't always a given, but as long as that happens, I also then get those things happen without my having to, run around and shill too much.
And you mentioned the Agualusa books, because you've done a number of his.
Yeah, we've just published, so the one which came out in the US a couple of weeks ago, called The Society of Reluctant Dreamers, was our 6th book together, 6th novel together. And he was the first person I translated, so it's his fault, basically, all of this. And I've co-translated a collection of his newspaper columns earlier this year, and I'm going to be doing a collection of his short stories in the autumn and the fall, which is something I've been wanting to do for a really long time. He's a great short story writer, and I've never yet been able to persuade anyone to publish them, but I got it this time. So the next Agualusa after Society of Reluctant Dreamers will be a collection of short stories, which will be coming from Archipelago in, I think, next year, probably.
Okay.
Or 22, I don't know.
Because he's, I think, who made me aware of you.
Right.
Perhaps, I'm not exactly sure. That kind of, he's the writer that when I think of you as a translator, that's the one. Yeah. He's the one that.
I think it's true about a lot of people. Like a lot of translators, even having worked with a lot of people, you get attached to the writer you've worked with the most, or the writer you worked with first, or the writer with whom you had noticed somehow. And I was really lucky to start my career translating him, and to have some success with our 2nd book, and to have been kind of on the coattails of this career for the last more than a decade now. And I haven't worked with anyone else quite this on this many books, which means not only working on 6 books together, but it also means more than a decade of meeting up and collaborating and doing events together and doing book tours together, and we won a couple of prizes together. So that is also, we have a kind of shared, there's a kind of shared trajectory we have, which is a very different experience and a very lovely experience. Different from, you collaborate on a project for a few months and then go your ways again.
Right. And was he someone that somebody approached you to work with him, or?
Yeah, a publisher friend. I had no intention of being a translator because, why would you? And a publisher friend wrote to me, this is a really long time ago, so this is about 2002. I was just about to publish my first book of my own, and a publisher wrote and said, "We've been pitched this novel by a guy called Eduardo Agualusa. Do you know anything about him?" And I went, "No idea who he is. Would you read him?" And so I read the book and I said, "This is brilliant, you should publish it." And this friend said, "Well, in that case, do you want to translate it?" And I said, "Sure." Which, on reflection, I always think now is a sort of insane thing to have said. And also an incredibly hubristic thing to say basically almost in one sentence, "Yes, I think this book is a masterpiece, and sure, I could write it. How hard can it be?" But I did that one book just sort of for fun and kind of as a favor, just to see what it was like in 2002, 2003, and then didn't translate again for years. So that was just that one outlier, and I was getting on with some attempt at having another kind of life. And it was only a few years later, same publisher came back to me, said, "Well, we're going to do another Agualusa novel. It was quite fun last time working together. Would you do a second one?" And the second one was a book called The Book of Chameleons, which is my second book of his and my second work of translation. And because of that, it won something called the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize in the UK, and it got picked up by by SNS in America. And so it meant that quite suddenly, even though I had no intention of doing this, I found myself with something laughably going to pretend was a career, and kind of in a position where, even though I was very new, didn't really know what I was doing, because it won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, it meant that the like 23 people in the UK who were interested in international fiction and translation, there only are 23 of them, but they all knew who I was on that night, May 1st, 2007. And so very quickly after that, I was fortunate I got to do a third Agualusa novel, and then a book by somebody else. And from then on, I've been not doing it full time, but doing it regularly at least. I haven't had more than 6 months without translating since 2007. And funnily enough, Agualusa, I think my first 4 books were all by him, and then I sort of betrayed him with lots of other writers for a really long time, and he wasn't published in English for quite a while. And it was only when we did The General Theory of Oblivion, which is 4 years ago. It was our first book together in 6 or 7 years. So I kind of got to come back to him, and we're now, no stopping us now. Yes, I blame him for quite a lot.
Well, I haven't finished it yet. I just started Society of Reluctant Dreamers this weekend.
Oh.
And I don't know, I'm not very familiar with like Angolan literature or that whole history, but I love the way he writes about these very dark times in his life and in his country's history in a very like kind of cinematic or almost whimsical way. Especially like General Theory of Oblivion is almost like a Coen Brothers movie in some ways.
Yeah. But
it's about very stark and awful things. But when you translated the Book of Chameleons, what year would that have been?
2006.
Right. And so as a bookseller, I feel like I think everybody's noticed that there's been kind of more of an appreciation for translated literature.
Sure. Yeah.
I assume you've kind of felt that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, I know the context here in the UK much better than there, but certainly talking to friends in the US who work as translators or as publishers of translation or as booksellers or agents. I mean, everyone I know, I think, has felt. The statistics don't always bear it out, but there's a kind of feeling of some improvement, anecdotal at least. And at least in the UK, one of the things that's pleasing is it's not just we still aren't publishing enough, but we're publishing more, and in a way, more importantly than that, the things that we're publishing are selling better. The sales data on translated fiction is in a way more heartening than the numbers of titles, because the numbers of titles don't I think, tell you much that's interesting. And we're seeing not only more being published and more copies being shifted. We're seeing a slow, that's positive, slow diversifying of the kinds of things that are being translated, the kinds of writers that are being translated, the kind of languages that are being translated. There are still obviously kind of outliers, languages that are translated much more than others, but it doesn't feel like there isn't quite such a stranglehold over what is making it into publishers from certain, a handful of small, big Western European languages.
Yeah, I do feel like, I mean, here at least, like, I feel like there's always been kind of a stigma. I don't know if stigma is the right word, but a reluctance from readers to read things that have been translated from other languages, unless it's like one of the really big names.
Yeah.
I used to have a very good friend who I was trying to get him into some stuff. And looking back, it was completely not his taste, but like when I was really first getting into like Bolaño, I was trying to get him to read it, and he didn't really care for it. And part of it was like he would tell me that he didn't like to read stuff that had been translated because he was worried he was losing something in that translation. But also at the same time, he was watching like subtitled foreign films and not having an issue with that. And so I think the best argument I've ever heard was that unless you can like read that language, there's no reason not to read the translation. Do you ever feel like there's stuff being lost in those books?
Sure, there are always things being lost. You've lost all of the original words, and what you've got is 80,000 completely different words, which a different writer is attempting to reconstruct something of the effect. So what you're going to get is going to be substantially different, and there'll be things that are lost and things that are gained, because otherwise it would be the same book in the same language. I think one of the problems we have is the assumption that a translation has to somehow be identical, and if it's not identical, it's going to be, it's all about the loss. The only measure of difference is loss. In a way that I don't think even the people who worry about that, even the people who are kind of suspicious of this intermediary between you and like the real thing, like it's not the real Tolstoy, I want to read the real Tolstoy. Those people presumably don't have any issue with listening to a song being sung or played rather than just sitting with the sheet music and producing the perfect version in their heads. It's of course possible to produce a rendering of a song like a rendering of a novel that is a massive betrayal and is appallingly tone deaf to what the score is telling you to do. But at the same time, a lot of the art that we consume is, and consume with huge pleasure, is art that has been mediated by a second artist, a second writer, a second creative person of whatever kind. And I'm very comfortable with the idea that it's going to be slightly different. But that means that there will be things that are gained as well as things that are lost.
Yeah, I guess if people should look at it more as a collaborative kind of effort, even if you're maybe, would you consider it that way, even if it's maybe, let's say the author isn't living and you're translating them?
I think, yeah, completely. And obviously my aim is to make it as much their work as possible. And my aim is not to traduce their intentions. But yeah, like I said, my aim is not to produce something different. My aim is not to traduce what they're intending to do. My aim is to produce something which is as much their work as it's possible to be. But at the same time, I recognize, and I hope my writers recognize, that whatever we produce is going to have, it may be, the structure may be theirs, and the deep thinking behind it may be theirs, but it's going to have my fingerprints all over it. And so it may be that, kind of think of it like, a novel in which the first 15 drafts were written by someone else, and then they pass it on to me, and then I write drafts 16 to 20. And there are kind of processes of evolution at all of those stages. There's quite a big leap between stage 15 and stage 16, because I will be throwing away all of their words and replacing them entirely with my words. But it is a sequence of a kind of evolutionary sequence in which all of the underpinning is theirs, and my aim is to do something. I suppose it is collaborative, but there is also this peculiar thing, I think, with translators who want, I think we most of us simultaneously want to be recognized for what we do, and also want you to feel like we're not there at all. I want you to feel like you have a strong feeling about Agualusa because you read him and forget that I'm there somehow. In the same way that you can lend Bolaño to a friend and you don't say, this is Bolaño, but it's not really, this is actually Natasha, really.
Right.
You want to say, this is Bolaño, in the same way that if you ask me, have you read War and Peace? I have read War and Peace. Do I read Russian well enough? Well, no, but I've read some spin-off of War and Peace that was written by someone.
Yeah, and it's
Redmond's words.
And so when you were first approached to translate something, did you have like, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of like curious about like the kind of like theories of translation and what's appropriate, because I've gotten the sense that things have kind of changed, because you mentioned like there's been like the idea that things need to be like literal and needs to be exact, but now it feels like there's more like maybe a bit of like creativity and artistry in what's allowed in translation. I don't know if I'm off base with that or not.
I think that's right. I think up to a point, these things go with fashion, and what was expected 20 or 30 years ago might not be what's expected now. The question is partly who is doing the expecting. When I translate, for the most part, I'm translating for publishers, which are commercial publishers of some kind, who are selling books through retailers. They're books that are going to be shelved alongside books in English. They're going to be reviewed alongside books in English. And they're going to go into the same market as a book that wasn't translated. And so for the most part, my aim is to produce it might be an Argentine crime novel, but you would sit it right next to the Scottish crime novels and the Oregonian crime novels and whatever. For the most part, the books will be bought in the same way as a Scottish crime novel and read in the same way as a Scottish crime novel. And so my aim is not to produce something that is literally faithful to things that are unhelpful. The obvious example is I've just finished. I have a book coming out shortly in the US and here, which is a book by Juan Pablo Villalobos, who's a Mexican novelist. And it's a really funny book. It is a very funny book in Spanish. I hope it remains a funny book in English. And one of the things that you have to do with a funny book is you have to build jokes, and the voice has to be funny, and there is wordplay that's a particular challenge, and so forth. At no point did it occur to me when I was working on this that it would be worth trying to preserve the literal meaning of the jokes rather than trying to produce a translation that is funny. This is what it almost always comes down to. I can choose, so there's an end of chapter 2, there's a really funny last line. I can translate it where I'm privileging the meaning, semantic thing is the thing that I'm keeping. It's not going to be funny, but it's literally the same. And, the sense is the same. Or I go, well, he's trying to be funny here. I'm going to have to change it to be funny because the rhythm has to be different, because the wordplay has to be different, because the cultural references work differently. It never occurred to me, if I'm translating a book that is supposed to be funny and that is supposed to make a reader in Asheville laugh in the same way that it makes a reader in Guadalajara laugh, It never occurred to me that I'm supposed to be doing anything other than finding a joke that has the same effect as his joke. And it never occurred to me that the author would ever want me to do this. I think it'd be a very, very strange author who would come back to me and say, well, I would rather you only stuck as close as you could to the meaning of my books. And I don't care whether the prose is elegant, I don't care whether the voices are plausible, I don't care whether the idioms are at all comprehensible, I don't care whether the jokes are funny, I don't care whether you have any sense of cadence in the narrative. It would be very strange, I think, for an author to want anything other than a reading experience which is as close to the reading experience they're attempting to create for their readers.
Yeah, so I guess the goal would be to catch the spirit of the thing that you're translating.
Yeah, to catch the spirit of it, and one of the measures of that is the effect on the reader. And partly that's something which is modulated very closely, kind of almost beat by beat throughout the book. But also it's a kind of cumulative thing where, you know, we have this with Villalobos quite a lot. The voices in this novel are really strong, and the voices in some cases are really funny. But there were a number of cases where I thought, well, actually, I can't make it funny in the same way in this place. But there's a really great opportunity which the English language gives me to do something which is the same sort of funny a paragraph earlier or 2 pages later. And that's completely in the spirit of the novel, and it's what I suspect Villalobos would have done if he'd been writing the book in English, because I'm just following what the English language allows, which are different things to what the Spanish language allows. And so the feeling of the reader should have at the end, the sense, how their experience of the spirit of the book should be the same, but it will have been produced by a very different set of tricks.
Were these things that were on your mind when you started off? Like, you talked about the first book you translated and just kind of, it seems like you just kind of decided to do it and you did it. And
yeah, I didn't, fortunately, I didn't think about any of this. And I think if at any point I'd thought, I wonder if translation is easy or difficult, I would have thought, no, screw this, there's no way I'm going to do this. This is a ridiculous thing to do. And so I did that first book, or those first 2 books, entirely unencumbered by, you know, knowledge of any kind. And even now, I think I'm probably, having had the good fortune of starting by accident and not knowing what I was doing, I am pretty good at, I don't know whether this is good, let's say it's good. I am pretty good at just doing the work and not thinking about what I'm doing. I don't think in the abstract really about the books that I'm working on. And it's interesting because I teach translation quite a lot. I do quite a lot of workshops. It's interesting to talk to students about tiny choices and tiny mechanical things that are happening when you're producing a text. But then always having to reassure them that actually in practice I don't do this myself in any kind of conscious sense. I'm sure I do, not consciously. I'm sure that I'm attuned, I hope, to the rhythm of a sentence in the original language, and something of that feeds into the rhythm of the sentence I'm producing in English. But I'm always running these workshops which give an entirely fraudulent sense that, you know, you can spend, you know, an entire day on the first sentence in a workshop. But if I actually did that, I would have starved to death really quickly if I was doing that in my professional life, because I'm trying to do, you know, thousands of words a day. So I do think a lot of those things get internalized, and having had the advantage, as I say, of not really having, I would say not taking it seriously, but not really having had to think about it to begin with, and discovering that it was fun to do it that way, that I worked, I think, quite well and quite quickly like that, and I enjoyed it. And also, I think I was also lucky that Agualusa is not very difficult. I think he's a brilliant writer, a lovely writer, but he comes into English really easily, actually. So I also didn't do 2 pages and think, well, I'm never doing that again. Could easily have happened if there are many other writers that would have had that effect on me.
I think that's interesting because I think usually we just kind of like focus on the technical part of translation, which is, I feel like, knowing a language and being able to transcribe something into a different language.
Yeah.
But that's kind of forgetting that there's an amount of artistry involved in translating something.
I think knowing another language is obviously a part of it. I can't remember who, this quote which I always use, and I can't remember who it comes from, but someone said, thinking that if you're bilingual means you can be a translator is like thinking, I have 2 hands, therefore I can be a pianist. I think, well, yes, up to a point, in that there is a sort of, basically it helps to have 2 hands if you're going to play the piano. But actually, I don't think of myself as a linguist. I'm not a particularly good linguist. The languages I translate from are not languages I'm proficient in as a speaker or as a writer. But there are many, many, many millions of people in the world who speak Spanish and speak English, and there are not many of them who could have done Savage Detectives or 2666. That's a really particular skill, and it's not just a skill of knowing lots of vocabulary from Latin American Spanish.
And so when you say you're not, well, I guess like my question is, how did you, I assume you have some sort of a knack for languages, or?
I have, so my mother is from Brazil.
Okay.
And my father is from Argentina. So I have, my languages are sort of genetic, if you like. I've never spoken anything other than English to my parents. I still only speak English to my parents. And I've never been a comfortable speaker of Portuguese or Spanish. I have, however, throughout my life been around people who've been speaking them, and so I'm used to consuming them. I can have a very basic conversation in both of those, and I can write very badly, but I read very comfortably, I understand very comfortably. I also translate from French, and my French is basically high school French. My French was at its best when I was 18 doing my A-level exams in the UK. But I read a lot, and I'm very comfortable as a reader of that language. And my language, my sort of passive, my consuming of the language has improved quite a lot. I have bits of other things. I have bits of other languages that I've studied times.
Well, you mentioned that you've heard lots of people speaking these languages.
Yeah.
I assume that also plays a part in it, because you need to know like the music of the language.
Sure. Though it's also odd because the 3 languages I translate from were also big. They're all big global languages. They're all languages that are multi-continental, multinational, and multi-continental. And so even Portuguese, I mean, it's odd. My experience was quite peculiar because the Portuguese that I speak, such as I speak it, is Portuguese from Brazil, and the Portuguese I'm most familiar with is Portuguese from Brazil. But the first 4 books I did were from Angola, a country I have yet to visit. And I must have been 30 books into my career before I did a Brazilian book. But translating a writer from Angola, I have the advantage of, a living author who can answer my questions. I have the advantage of Google Street View, which is a blessing. Various other things that allow me to fake some familiarity with this thing that I'm translating. Google Street View is amazing. Google Street View is the best thing for translating.
Why is that?
The kind of thing I use it for all the time. There are always things that a writer thinks they have included in the text but haven't encoded because it's stuff that's in their head, so they don't feel the need to express them. And the kind of thing that I find myself always doing, you have a character in a novel who is in the town square, and it's a town I've never been to because it's in the interior of Brazil. And they walk, and the sentence in Portuguese says something like, he walked to the church where he met his wife. And I naturally in English would like the sentence to say he walked up to the church, or he walked down to the church, or he walked over to the church. Without a preposition, that sounds odd to me in English. He walked to the church. I feel like there's something missing. But I don't know if he walked up to the church or down to the church or over to the church until I can actually get a fix on it by Google Street View.
I never thought of that as like a missing piece. And I feel like I read a lot of books that are set in places that I've never been and I'm not really familiar with. And I've never thought to look up what they're actually.
No, but the information is there. And also you don't, if you're reading it, it doesn't matter if you're making your own choice. There was an example, I was doing a workshop with a great Brazilian writer called Zé Luís Passos a few years ago. And there is a moment in his novel in Portuguese where there's a character standing in the town square waiting for somebody. And the sentence in the Portuguese said something like, he was there in the square waiting for 15 minutes. And in the workshop group, we were thinking, well, actually in English, we would quite like to say, he sat there for 15 minutes. Or he stood there for 15 minutes. And the Portuguese didn't say whether he was standing or sitting there. And so we said to Zé Luís, well, is he standing or sitting? We would quite like in English to be a bit more specific, if you don't mind. And Zé Luís said, well, obviously he's sitting. And we said, well, you say obviously, but it's not there. You as a reader might read this book and picture the character sitting or picture the character standing, and actually it doesn't really matter. But as a translator, I have to pick one. And in that case, it's not that it's something which is, a massive betrayal of the author's vision, because the author even thought that he'd included this information, because he was picturing this person sitting in the square, and he wrote, she sat in the square waiting. Sorry, he wrote, and she was in the square for 15 minutes waiting. He thought the information was somehow, that she was sitting down was somehow encoded in what he'd written, and it wasn't. As a translator, if I want to put a verb, if I want to paint a picture that is as precise as possible, I may need to pick one. As a reader, it probably doesn't matter if you picture it wrong.
That makes sense. I think it's also interesting just to like, I think as a reader, you just kind of assume that there's a book and it gets translated, and we never really see all the little decisions that get made.
Right.
Well, I guess the way you talk about it is you don't see those decisions either necessarily.
No, and certainly if you read a book in which it says a character walked down to the church, you sort of half process that piece of information. It's not very important or very interesting, but you half process it, and at no point do you think, this is an interesting preposition. I wonder what the French preposition used to be. And I think partly this also speaks to what we want translations to do, because I don't on the whole want you to read my translations and be conscious of those decisions. I mean, of course, I want nothing but adulation all of the time, really. But also what I want you is you to get to the end of the novel and forget that there was someone getting in the way.
Right.
Which also I think it's partly also the most of the writing I like is the kind of writing where you aren't constantly being reminded that there's writing happening, because writing can actually be quite tiresome. And one of the I said earlier that there is this analogy with performance, with having an interpreter of the piece of art, and I think there is a very tidy parallel with an actor playing Hamlet, where one of the things you want when you're watching a performance of Hamlet is not to spend the whole 4 hours going, oh, look at that acting, look at all I can see, all that act, I can see so much acting going on. Of course, you get to the end and go, wow, what a virtuosic piece of something or other. But actually, you want there to be something which is more visceral and more involving happening in the process of reading it. So actually, I'm not sure whether I want people to notice those decisions while they're happening at the time. But I would quite like you to get to the end of the book, having loved the book and having thought about and having found the jokes really funny, and think something clever happened there.
So I have a book club that I've been doing, I guess, for about 5 years now. It focuses on translated literature, and we try and be diverse with it. Like, I've always been kind of drawn to like French and Spanish language stuff, especially like Latin American writers, but I always have to kind of make sure I'm branching out and doing languages from around the world. And one thing that comes up occasionally, I think we've kind of gotten away from trying to like figure this out, but one thing that comes up occasionally is this book, whatever book we're reading, is it a good translation? And how difficult that is to know if you don't speak the language. Like, it's like you just kind of have to make these kind of like, you just get a sense of it. And I feel like the times where the translations are good is when you don't feel the translator.
I think that's often the case. One of the things that was interesting about the Villalobos book I just did, there's quite a long translator's note at the end, which the publisher and other stories allowed me to write a fairly substantial piece, which basically says, this was my experience and this is what I was trying to do. And one of the things that I hope that will allow is readers to, they can decide that I've succeeded or failed, but they have some sense of what, I describe what I think the book is doing in Spanish, and these are the things that I do in order to try and preserve the things that I think are important in English. And I love reading translators' notes, partly for that reason, because you get to the end of the book and go, well, actually, I think I have a sense it was really good because the jokes were really funny, like properly, genuinely funny in English. What I have no idea of is maybe there are no jokes in the original. I mean, I have no idea whether this is an entirely delinquent version of that other book. What I can tell if I'm reading a book in translation or not in translation is, does the voice work? Does the structure work? Do the characters do what I want them to do? Does the ending have the effect I want it to have? Precisely where the friction is between the two sequential authors who are involved in this is not always obvious. I find this, I don't review very much, but when I do, it's always something which is, it's always an interesting little tightrope. And I find myself describing what I think of the effect or what I think is happening, and being very, very careful not to attribute praise or blame to one person or the other unless it's really obvious. So I can talk about what the voice is doing, and I can talk about what the prose is doing. And all I can say is that in this English, which is a piece of work based on this other piece of work, this is what works and this is what doesn't work. But it's not always obvious whether this is a good translation of a very bad thing, this is a bad translation of a very good thing, whether both of these people are entirely reprehensible and there is nothing to recommend it at all. It's a fairly safe bet that if it works incredibly well in translation, that there are two really good sequential pieces of work that got it there. But it is sometimes difficult to, I think, especially when there is something wrong, not always when there's something right, especially when there's something wrong, to put your finger on whose fault exactly is this. I do remember a review, an Amazon review years ago of a novel I translated. The review was mostly full of praise, except the reviewer kept getting annoyed because the main character kept making really dumb decisions. The main character was otherwise likable, kept making really, or relatable, kept making otherwise really dumb decisions. And the reviewer said, on the other hand, maybe it's just the translation. And I read this and thought, how much power do you think I have? Do you think I really am in a position to, I'm going to change all of the characters' decisions in this novel? I mean, I would love to have that power, but alas.
I think the times I feel like a translation might have been better are just when like you'll get a sentence that's not quite in tune with the rest of the book. Like there's a little awkward like things that could use some polishing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the only times that I'm like feel aware. But that's the times when I get like pulled out of a book, perhaps. And so I guess like, to me, and you might disagree with this, but it seems like if you're doing a good job as a translator, no one's going to notice you. And if you're maybe not, that's when you get noticed. And I don't know if that's...
I think that's mostly true. I mean, I think the other thing is there are a lot of people involved in this process. Every one of my translations is better for having been edited by a really good editor. I mean, there are a lot of people who get it to the point at which it's being read by readers, which means there are more people to blame and also more people to praise than we normally do. But I think there's also an assumption, especially because the editorial habits in other countries are very different to the editorial habits in the Anglophone world. You could argue, I think, that if I'm translating a book from Spanish, where actually the tone is slightly uneven in the original, and then maybe a few sentences, as you say, which just somehow the register is a little bit askew in the original. Maybe it's my job to not to stick very closely to that slight jarring in the Spanish, or that slight incoherence in the Spanish. Maybe my job is to disguise that a little bit, and to do a little editorial work that probably should have been done to the original. And
right. I've heard that debated too, like editorial work, because my understanding is there's most publishers, when they get a translation of something, they're going to edit that and maybe even take things out. And then there's some that don't want to touch anything that has to do with the plot. I don't know if you've encountered that, if that's still practiced or...
Yeah, both of those things happen. Both extremes happen. There are some publishers who work on the assumption that the original is done, is finished, is fixed in aspect, and we're not changing anything. And so the translation will only change like all of the words, but it won't change anything other than all of the words. And then there are some publishers who, and I usually welcome this, who take the translation and go, well, actually, if this were being sent to us in English, we wouldn't just do a little line edit and then a little proofread. We would actually suggest things that are slightly more drastic, and I'm not sure why we don't, or we aren't allowed to do that here, especially if it's a book that maybe hasn't been edited in the way we understand editing in the original language. So I've had a few cases of editors who've done not sort of wild and delinquent things to books, but who've suggested little cuts and suggested little moves in ways that I think someone frankly should have suggested to the original and didn't, because that's not the habit. But one book I did last year, for example, there was a publisher that basically said to the author, chapter, whatever it is, 17, I think we should, it's 4 pages long, I think it should be 2 pages long, because the story was just picking up at this point, the plot was just picking up, we had just got into it, and actually this is not the place to, this is absolutely the wrong place for a bit of self-indulgent voice writing. And the author completely understood this, and the author, I suspect, would have been grateful if someone had said this to them in their original publishing house. And the idea somehow that the original is unimprovable seems peculiar and like unlikely. But there are publishers who work on the assumption that they won't do any of the kinds of edits that involve the author. They will only be editing. All of the edit will be essentially on a sentence and syllable level. And not all authors, if you're a fairly established author who's been working, with some acclaim in your language for 30 years, there are some of those authors who do feel slightly aggrieved at being told by some editor they've never heard of, we think you should reconsider your ending or whatever it is.
Right, and I guess also like, if someone's doing a new translation of War and Peace, they're not going to cut huge chapters out of that book.
No, on the other hand, every time someone does a new production of Hamlet, it's a slightly different script, and you cut things and you move things around. And the assumption is that what we think is going to be the optimal telling of the story for today's audience, for this particular theatre, for this particular cast, is going to involve a little bit of you know, optimizing for your audience somehow. I think, yes, I think War and Peace also. War and Peace is arguably better than the average novel. I think it's not a controversial thing to say. I suspect, I mean, I read it a very long time ago, but I suspect even War and Peace 1 might improve. I find it hard to imagine what a work of art, at least a work of art on the scale of a novel, that is actually unimprovable. I find it hard to imagine what that would be. And as I say, I've published 70 books probably of one kind or another. And I can think of 2 instances where I think the edit made the book worse. And that leaves 68 instances where the edit were having someone else, a clever person reading the book and articulating what their experience of reading the book was. Always makes it better. Except War and Peace.
Well, excellent. Thank you for doing this. I don't want to keep you much longer.
I know, it's fine.
But I really appreciate you doing this. And again, on such short notice, I'm realizing I need to be more organized with all of this. So,
well, I'm assuming that most people you're talking to aren't able to leave the house anyway. So,
no, that's been like the key to this, is that I can just like ask people to get on the computer and talk to me for 45 minutes. So
yeah, where do you think we're going to be going, really?
Right. So
I find myself, a surprising amount of my day is kind of scheduled because I have Zoom meetings or conversations or interviews or whatever. But at the same time, I do have 24 hours a day basically in this room.
Right.
So there's always a gap.
And I think you know one of our former booksellers, Jacob.
I do know Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about him. I think Jacob is how I first heard of Malaprop, actually.
Okay. I'm never sure. There's some people that I reach out to, and I don't know if they like are aware of us at all. So that's good.
I knew about Malaprops originally, I think, from Jacob, whom I know from the translation world, because we translators basically all know each other. And he was in my summer school a couple of years ago. And I think Stefan Tobler from And Other Stories, did Stefan come by there?
Yes, he did.
Right, so I had dinner with Stefan and Sean Bai, whom you possibly know. Stefan and Sean and I all had dinner in New York in whenever it was in the autumn, and he was about to go on his little road trip, and he was about to go down to leave New York and head down and stop in Asheville.
Okay.
And so I, having just seen Jacob also in New York with the same trip actually, Stefan he then mentioned that he was on his way to a start at Malaprop.
And he was great, and I think he enjoyed his time here, even though it was for maybe a day. So.
Yeah, they're doing amazing things. They're great. They're great publisher. One of the things of which I'm immensely proud in my years of being in this business, something like it. So I've known Stefan since, again, a summer school in 2007 when I was starting. And he, a couple of years later, had this idea for a publishing house that was going to do things a bit differently. And he wrote to me and I think a couple of other people and said, I have this idea, publishing house, this is how it's going to work, it's going to be different in this way, this is what we're going to do. What do you think? And I wrote back and said, well, I mean, it's a very charming, it's very sweet. But I mean, obviously it's never going to work. But I mean, it's lovely. It's a really nice idea. It's obviously never going to work. And I've spent the last 10 years slowly, delightfully watching myself be made to look like a moron. The first year, they were shortlisted for the Booker Prize in their first year, and I thought, I might have misjudged this. I might slightly have misjudged the... Anyway, I'm a big fan, and I'm doing a book for them next month, 2 months.
Yeah. Did you have a book background before you started translating, or?
So I worked in a bookstore for many years, which is what all the best people do. I had done some writing. I'd done a bit of, reading for publishers. I published a book that I wrote myself in 2003. So around the same time I was doing the first Agualusa book. I was doing other things kind of in books and kind of contiguous with translation work, but not actually doing any translating. And yet here I am, mysteriously.
Well, we never know. Yeah, I mean, who knew 2 months ago we'd be doing this?
I think this is true. It's very different it's different now with the translation profession, but until relatively recently, most translators I know who started like a decade ago or more, like I did, most did it by accident. They were offered something, there was an opportunity, someone asked them a favor. Now there are lots and lots of people who, for I think mostly good reasons, who actively want to do this, who want to get into translation, who want to know how to do it. I get an email, 2 or 3 emails a week from someone saying, I'd like to be a translator. Can you give me some idea where to start or whom to talk to or where to find information? And again, because we all translators and would-be translators all basically know each other, there is a sense of there is a kind of new community of translators who are people who actively want to do it and are making their way into the profession, and who are 1 or 2 books in maybe, and who are great, like Jacob actually. But it was relatively unusual until recently that anyone would actively seek out this job, rather than trip over something and look around and go, shit, oh my God, I'm a translator.
Yeah, I do like the fact that you say that you assume it's for good reasons, because I don't think anybody, for the most part, is in the book industry trying to get rich or. No,
you have to be really dumb to be doing it for the wrong reasons.
Right.
There are right reasons. There are wrong reasons, but why on earth would you? I think translation also is of the jobs in the book industry, translation is one of the better paid ones, actually. I think we're in much less trouble than most people who are in this business. One of the problems we have is if you work into English, where the money isn't bad, but there isn't enough work. And so I can make a living because I translate 4 or 5 books a year, but I'm lucky that I get 4 or 5 books a year.
Right.
If there isn't enough work to go around, which there isn't for most people, if you're a translator, a starting out translator from French or a starting out translator from Spanish, you could make a living if there was enough work for you. But if you're only able to pick up a book a year or a book every couple of years, then suddenly it becomes extremely hard to make rent.
Yeah, I remember when Jacob was starting out, he started looking for Galician writers because he felt like all of the Spanish language stuff had been taken up already.
Yeah.
Which I think is...
So Spanish is, as you can imagine, there are like 27 million Spanish translators. On the other hand, there is also much more demand.
Right.
For a translator from Spanish or a translator from French. Galician, Jacob is one of a tiny handful of people who do it. And he does it very well. But the American and the British publishing industry are not commissioning 100 Galician novels every year.
Right.
And so he has the advantage of having that kind of niche, but at the same time, it is quite a small niche, and there just isn't enough work to go around. He obviously, having Spanish, he can also do Spanish, and like many other people, he worked in a bookstore, and like most translators are also doing other things, many of them in bookstores.
Well, I mean, we'll always have them, so.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, here's hoping.
Well,
I don't feel confident about making any prediction to this point, but let's work on that assumption.
Yeah. Who knows? We try not to think about it too hard, but
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like we're gonna be okay. It's the industry as a whole is going to be completely different after this, but
yeah,
hopefully in some ways for the better. So we can knock on wood, I guess.
That's very hopeful. Let's go with that.
Yeah, it depends on my mood, but today I feel hopeful. So
Well, I'm glad you've recorded yourself saying that
yes,
now.
yes. I'll try to
It
be
is now
positive.
on record. Justin says we're going to be fine. It's all on record.
It's all going to be great.
Thank God for that. I wasn't sure actually, but
Yeah.
that's good to know.
And if it's not, you can just blame me.
I shall send people to you.
Please do. All right. Well, unless you've got anything to add, I think that was very generous of you.
Not at all.
To sit down for this long.
Thank you very much.
We can't do events or anything, but it's nice to have like some sort of content for people at home. And I also like have found this interesting as like a document of what people are doing during these times, because it obviously isn't going to last forever. So it might be nice for people to go back and see how these times were.
Yeah.
So
I'm translating a kind of quarantine diary thing. A brilliant Portuguese novelist is writing a piece a day, which has been published in newspapers in various places in the world. I'm translating every day his latest piece. But I keep thinking about what it will be like to read these pieces. I'm hoping we're going to make them into a book, because I'm thinking about what it'll be like to read these pieces a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how actually these things get fixed in our memory, these experiences that are in some ways very weird and in some ways stop being weird quite quickly.
right. And you like see people pulling up articles about Spanish flu from 100 years ago and how people were dealing with that. Like that was not even something like we really, like you heard about it, but you never really, like, no one studies that. I feel like, so, yeah. So it's interesting that to have those things to look back at and see how much things really haven't changed and how much they have.
One of the things they were talking about, they got circulated around the time the lockdown here started, and you might have seen the same, was these various, great works of art that were produced, like Plague in London, early 1600s. That was when Shakespeare wrote King Lear.
Right.
This is possibly putting slightly unreasonable pressure on people to say, well, last time we had one of these things.
Right.
Because actually we do, even though Spanish flu isn't studied here, people here have studied the plague in London in the 17th century, let's say, 17th century. That is part of the history we studied. On the other hand, if you look at that and go, well, now I'm supposed to write King Lear, what the fuck is this? How is this in any way a reasonable expectation of barely keeping up with my emails? And yet.
Well, maybe someone is. It only takes one person, so.
Yeah, how many do we need, really?
Yeah, just one more King Lear and we'll be all set.
And almost every writer I know is really, really struggling to write that. Or struggling to write fiction, I should say. Everybody is writing a diary for a newspaper. There's like full-time, every writer has got a column somewhere in my quarantine experience. But everyone I've talked to, all of my friends who are novelists, have found it really, really difficult to write fiction at this point.
Yeah, I feel like
the great quarantine, the great COVID-19 novel will show up before too long, I'm sure.
Yeah, or at least somebody thinks they're writing one, which it's also.
So the other day, someone put something on Twitter saying, does anyone know any really good novels about like lockdown and isolation and that kind of thing? I was racking my brains and couldn't think of anything. And then someone posted, wasn't there that book called A General Theory of Oblivion about a woman who locks herself in a house for 30 years? I thought, oh shit, yes, of course. So that's exactly what it's about. About a woman who decides actively self-isolates and locks herself in her apartment for 30 years and just looks at the world outside and refuses to engage, and she bricks up her front door. And I completely not connected with that, but it turns out there's a book on the subject I know very well.
Well, that's the interview I sent you with Hernan. He mentioned that he actually wrote a thesis on literature about isolation when he was in college, I guess.
Right.
And so he's been studying this for a long time. He's given me lots of recommendations, but I guess that was very convenient that it happened that way.
If you're in the mood for more isolation novels at this time.
Yeah, I mean, there's people that are buying anything on epidemics, like with selling copies of The Stand, which I feel like I want to be away from that, but I guess some people like to feel like they're in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't completely. Well, people are very strange.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking your time, and once we get this done, I'll send it your way. And
Sure.
thank you so much.
No problem.
All right, bye.